I don't see you.
Yeah, wait, I have to, now, can you see me? Wait, you know what?
In a sense, yes. Almost. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect.
I have to bring up my, yeah.
Okay, here we are. I'll put you seeing the students and I will sit with them. Let's see if it works.
Okay, let me, hang on one second. Let me turn off my big screen because I have two and it's confusing. My camera's on the small one. Okay.
Okay, we agreed with the students that you can talk between half an hour until 1 hour to answer. Then we have a dialogue. Probably there are other questions and the dialogue. So it's okay. Tell me.
What I have done is I grouped the questions together so that I talk about the foundation of the questions and then discuss some set of questions and move on to another aspect of the theory and related questions and so on.
Perfect. Okay, this is the small class, but they are affectionate. They are all here. So you see them? Yes. Probably.
Yes, I see them. Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, sit together. It's easier.
Sit together. Okay, let's go. You can begin.
Okay, so hang on a second. Let me start by reiterating a little bit of what I gave you in the handout, the preface. And the point there, for me, this is very fundamental, is that what I'm trying to do is to reconstruct or excavate a consistent theoretical paradigm which has been built in many ways verbally and historically, but lost because it was done prior to the mathematization of economics, and therefore the formal representation of it was minimal. And as a result, with the rise of neoclassical economics, instead of asking what Adam Smith really said, we were told what Adam Smith should have said, or meant to say if he had been educated at MIT or Harvard or, for that matter, Cambridge or Rome or whatever nowadays. This is an attempt to translate ideas into the existing framework. But I would argue that that's a fundamentally different project, and it's something which I strongly oppose. And unfortunately, that has an implication. And that implication is that my argument attempting to construct the logical foundations that are common to Smith, Ricardo, Marx, and Keynes gets displaced by the opposition between neoclassical theory and those who reject it. And this rejectionism tends to lead to modifications of the standard theory. And that's something which I want to oppose. I strongly oppose. If you modify an existing theory, you remain within it. If you wish to have a new foundation, you have to leave the theory and begin somewhere else. For instance, Darwin, when he's considering the evidence that we have on biology, comes up with a different paradigm, a different theoretical foundation. He doesn't go and ask the church how to modify to account for everything from cellular beings to chimpanzees and humans. As you know, his argument was strongly opposed by churches everywhere. In fact, in the United States, there's still places where you cannot mention Darwin's view without having some warning that this may be shocking to people who enter. For instance, there are museums in Texas that have a plaque that's called, that says, be prepared to see material that you may find upsetting so that you don't have to enter if you don't want to. This is today in the modern world. In a similar way, if we look at the history of astronomy, we see that people have known for a very long time that the Earth was not the center of the universe. Nonetheless, the top academics, thinkers in Europe, had to constantly modify and adapt the evidence so that it would fit into the idea of a geocentric world. And they did this by introducing imperfections. This is well known that for each deviation of the actual orbit of a planet from its supposed center, they had to add certain degrees of imperfections to account for the actual data. And this went on for hundreds, if not 1,000 years, until Kepler comes along and says, and Kepler, by the way, was a very religious man. He was a Protestant rather than a Catholic, very religious, and he believed that God actually made laws that was for humans to divine, so to speak, to observe, but those laws were not the laws that the church mandated. And he eventually found the law of orbits, which is that it was an ellipse. Now, you can view an ellipse as an imperfect circle, but that has no meaning because in Kepler, the ellipse is the law, and the circle has no place except as a collapsed version of an ellipse. So these reversals are very fundamental, and that leads me to my argument that there is a way to construct a framework that is contrary, that is consistent with the evidence, consistent with the writings of the four great economists I mentioned, but inconsistent with neoclassical theory and post-Keynesian theory. Because post-Keynesian theory also begins by observing that the empirical evidence doesn't fit the theory of perfect competition, and from this Kalecki constructs a theory of imperfect competition. There is no such thing as imperfect anything without the implied perfection. Just as churches have always said that humans are imperfect and God is perfect, if you use the word imperfect, you are implicitly accepting the notion of perfection. So when I focus on things like real competition, real macrodynamics, real turbulent equilibration, I'm talking about that not as a deviation from perfection, but rather as the rule itself, the law in itself. Just as an ellipse is not a deviation from a circle, it is the law. And we begin from that and then proceed to the empirical evidence. Now, I mentioned that the logic of the theory of competition and the theory of macrodynamics is that they are regulated, they are expressions of the fact that capital is dominated by profitability, that capitalism is dominated by profitability. This is a very fundamental point, because one of the questions, for instance, that someone asked is, well, how can you say that it's real competition versus perfect competition when in fact we know that capitalism changes all the time and that reality changes, and therefore we have to keep shifting and changing the underlying notion? Well, I disagree with that. That's a point of my disagreement. If you begin from something like perfect competition, then the reality is always disjoint. And this requires you to always add some variation and some imperfection, which you can keep adding because it's wrong in the first place. You keep adding lists of deviations. The question talked about Veblen's theory of irrational individual behavior. Now, this for me is a giveaway. What is irrational human individual behavior? It is the opposite of rational human behavior. But rational human behavior is a complete and total fiction. It was an ideological construction, and to attribute to people who don't follow the false story of rationality, attribute that to irrationality is in itself an irrational outcome. It is a response to a deviation of reality from the theory, and that's not irrationality. The defect is in the theory, not in the behavior. So I never use the word irrational behavior. The other part of the question was captains of finance and theories of rational bubbles and so on. Again, this is clear. The question presupposes that you are within the neoclassical paradigm whose job it was to explain bubbles within its paradigm. And from this, using rationality and rational expectations, comes the idea of rational bubbles. But my argument of bubbles has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the logic of capital, the logic of profitability, and how it leads to bubbles as a normal part of the balancing act. A bubble is a normal overshooting, and the consequent collapse is the undershooting. The effect of the two is to maintain a balance. I'll come back to that. That leads to another important point. It's clear that capitalism is a highly evolving and dynamic system. Anybody observing it will see that evolution. So it's reasonable to ask, how could one possibly say that there are laws that operate in a system that changes all the time? Leaders change, institutions change, culture changes, technology changes. How could it possibly be that there are principles that are common to capitalism across its different stages? And my answer is, because the one thing that does not change is the dominance of profitability. And my book is an attempt to show those aspects, not all aspects. It's not a religious guide to reality. It is a scientific guide. And therefore, it's those aspects which can be derived from the domain of profitability. The whole book is about how different particular aspects of capitalism depend on the domain of profitability. Now, other aspects I haven't covered and could be derived also from this, but the book took me 15 years, and I thought it would be wise to finish it before I died, because that is a well-known difficulty, let's say, with Marx, who not only didn't tell us what he was planning to do, he didn't do it. So it is a problem which I hope people will try to state more often what they plan to do so we can judge whether it works. So let me use that as a transition to the macro dynamics. The macro dynamics have to do with how profitability, which I elaborate in the theory of real competition, in a wide variety of domains, in interest rates, exchange rates, profit rates, relative prices, all of those things that cover the first, from chapter 6 to 12, chapter 6 to 11, have an implication macro level, because macro is not a separate domain. Macro is the aggregation of micro. It is the result of individual agent behavior. So in that sense, Lucas is right that macro is founded on individual behavior, but that's nothing new. There is no macroeconomist who doesn't know this. Friedman knew it, Marx knew it, Keynes knew it. So to say that it is founded on individual behavior is not to say that the laws of the whole are simply reflections of the individual. In other words, the whole false notion of a representative agent is precisely designed to get around the fact that there are emergent properties in the whole. Now, this is a trivial point. It used to be said in economics, this is the difference between quantity and quality. Remember dialectics, which nobody ever talks about anymore? That quantity changes into quality, that the cells interacting with each other have created an organism whose behavior is different from the individual cells. Now, this is a trivial point in every discipline except economics. And it's astonishing to me that anybody can swallow the idea that the whole is the same thing as any individual part. I don't know any science would accept that. Indeed, I don't know any philosophy would accept that. And it shows us the degree of our brainwashing, that we tend to accept these things because they're presented formally in mathematical form. Now, I have a lot to say about the mathematical form, but one more point. Implied in the idea of real processes is the idea of turbulent equilibration. By turbulent equilibration, I mean overshooting and undershooting, what Soros calls reflexive behavior also, which is that people's actions interact and create a behavior pattern which is unsustainable, and the collapse of that pattern is in fact the assertion of the underlying centers of gravity. So the sustainability comes from overshooting and undershooting, from turbulent dynamics. Now that has a mathematical implication. If you're going to talk about equilibration in the real sense, you must have the tools to deal with that. And just looking at a point of equilibrium may be a start. Marx does this when he looks at the schemes of reproduction. All the classical economists do this when they look at prices of production as prices reflecting equal profit rates. But none of them mean by this that this is the description of the actual existence, but rather of the hidden center of gravity, what is called sometimes in dynamics the hidden attractor, around which the reality is pushed and pulled. That means that if you're going to formalize something like turbulent equilibration, you have to use nonlinear tools. And you, in fact, may have to use tools we don't have yet because they're not adequate to this reality. You cannot deny the reality merely because you don't know how to explain it. Our difficulty as theorists, as economists, is to explain the patterns, not to say that they are irrational because we don't explain them. Then obviously irrationality is on us. With that in mind, let me answer some of the questions that were posed, and I want to do them in groups. So let me do it first on competition, open it up to any more questions, then do it on macro dynamics and open it up to questions. So one of the questions was, in the theoretical, in the empirical evidence which I present, but not only just me, but many other people over time, Bertram Sheffield, so many of my students, Mel Bienenfeld, and others have presented, is that the basic argument in Riccardo is very powerful. Now remember, Riccardo is a theorist. So when we oppose theory to empirical evidence, we're opposing only some theories. Not my theory, not Bertram Sheffield's, not Riccardo's, not Marx's, but Sraffa's. And Sraffa does not ever actually talk about any empirical evidence. And there's only one quote that I found from Sraffa, which I got from Riccardo Bellofiore, which is Sraffa's mention that, of course, in the aggregate, profit and surplus value will be the same, and total price and total value will be the same, so that the transformation problem issue is really not valid in that sense that there is any persistent deviation. What I focus on, and I made this argument myself also before I saw Riccardo's quote from Sraffa a long time ago, when I estimated the difference between money profits and value profit rates and so on, and showed them to be exceedingly small. But that raises a question. If a particular theoretical literature, in this case Sraffa and Sraffians, Steedman, Sheffield, the two most important ones, Bassanetti, by the way, doesn't make this argument, say that at the theoretical level they cannot see any reason why the movements of individual prices will not be extremely complex. They use that to illustrate, use small examples to illustrate this complexity. That doesn't mean that there is no reason. It just means they don't see it. As soon as you look at the empirical evidence, you see that Riccardo's argument that the relative prices are dominated by direct and indirect unit labor costs, which is essentially his labor value, because if wages are the same, then unit labor costs are the same thing as labor time, are proportional to labor time. So this empirical evidence forces us to ask, why could that be? How could that be? And here there's a very interesting answer, which has actually come up in recent literature. Let me mention, Bertram Sheffield was probably the most, Steedman and Sheffield, but Sheffield, the most mathematical Sraffian, a student of Sraffa's, who argued again and again that theoretically there is no reason why relative prices cannot go up and down, and therefore wage profit curves will not be curved in multiple and complicated ways. In fact, he believed that so strongly that he called all these curved patterns normal, or regular rather, and he called the simpler patterns, the ones that we're finding empirically, he called them irregular. Well, now, Bertram was a person I'm deeply fond of, had never done a bit of empirical work in his life until he did. And when he did it, he and his co-author discovered everywhere that wage profit curves are essentially smooth and either near linear. And I can talk more about what near linear means, but they essentially have very little curvature. So they're not quite linear, but they have none of the patterns that Sraffians have built their whole theoretical edifice on. And to his credit, Bertram switched sides. He then began to explore the theoretical reasons why the empirical patterns held. Now, this is how physics works, for instance, how biology works. You look at the reality and you begin to theorize about the reality, not about your fantasy. And that is the difference between science and, say, neoclassical economics, or religion for that matter. So Bertram and some others looked at an argument which had been raised by Andreas Brody in Poland. Brody had asked himself, what happens if to all of these deviations, well, let me step back a minute. Brody was concerned as a former planner about how fast one can estimate the balanced growth vector. If you start from any arbitrary observed vector and you calculated it using essentially a Sraffa system on the quantity side, and you iterated it, how many iterations would you need to get to the correct one? Now notice that is exactly the dual of the classic transformation problem. You begin with prices proportional to labor values, and then you iterate, as I did in my article on the transformation problem a long time ago. I showed that you can iterate that and you get a final price of production. Brody's question was, how fast does this iteration converge? And he hypothesized that the bigger the matrix, the more rapid the iteration. The only problem is that he didn't have big matrices. So what he did is he began to create big matrices. The matrices that he had were on the order of 30 or something. So he began to create larger matrices by simply filling them with random numbers. And he found something quite startling. As the matrices began to be bigger, the convergence was more rapid. And as they approached very large, the conversion was one shot. Now think of what that means. If you were doing it from the side of Marx, the convergence would mean that the difference between labor value and prices of production was one deviation, i.e. Marx's transformation. Now, that's quite an extraordinary mathematical result. Bertram picked this up, Scheffel picked this up, and began to investigate the properties of large matrices if they are random. And here's what was found. As large random matrices get bigger and bigger, the eigenvalues, the second subdominant eigenvalues go to zero. So in effect, you have a matrix with only one eigenvalue, one and the other zero, the rest is zero, and that is a condition for the perfect transformation in the sense of Marx, because one iteration gives you the right answer. So this seems like it's wonderful. This solves the empirical problem, it solves the theoretical problem, it reinstates Marx's transformation problem. The only difficulty is that I think it's wrong. I think it's wrong because the assumption that large matrices are random, which gives you all these nice results, is wrong. And so I've spent some years examining large matrices. It's the work I was doing this morning, for instance, last night, for instance. We have developed very large matrices from US input output tables, and we show certain patterns, which is the distribution of eigenvalues, approaches a limiting curve. Unfortunately, I don't know what that limiting curve is, but I do know, I can see, I don't know mathematically what it is, but it is always the same curve with every big matrix. But that curve is not the shape of a random matrix, so it's not true that one iteration gives it, but it is still a theoretical problem of great significance because If you can solve that problem, you have an explanation, a theoretical explanation for why the empirical results are so close to direct and indirect labor time or direct and indirect unit labor costs, i.e. Riccardo's proposition turns out to be correct. It turns out that that deviation from labor values and prices of production depend not only on the profit rate, but on the distribution of these eigenvalues. Now, I can't say more about that here, but this is an illustration of my point, which is that you have to take the reality as your guide. And even if you get such a nice result that Marx was correct and the transformation was right, if you make a certain assumption, you have to also ask, is that assumption correct? I would be more than happy, given my history and my work, to say that the transformation problem is solved in one iteration, but it's not true. You can see that by trying to do the solution, but you can also see that the underlying assumption is not true. So that leads me in a different direction, and that's how science proceeds. It proceeds by confronting the theory with the facts. Now, that doesn't mean inventing a new theory, but exploring the implications of the existing theory also. So when I'm asked, the theoretical literature, I always answer, whose theoretical literature? Not mine, not Sheffield's, not Brody's, not a bunch of other people I can cite, which I do in my book actually. So it's always a question between some theories and other theories. But, a second question had to do with monopoly. And it says how monopoly with an insuperable entry barrier of one or more necessary inputs for an industry can alter relative price determination from the standard real competition equalization process. Now again, what is really striking to me is the idea that of monopoly. I grew up as an economist in New York where Braun and Sweezy and Magdoff were literally my next door neighbors that were 2 blocks away. And I asked, and they always talked about monopoly. Moreover, many of my colleagues were post-Keynesians, and they always talked about monopoly. And I always asked the same question. Please, I don't understand what you mean by monopoly unless you tell me what you mean by competition. And then suddenly, everybody's in your classical. Suddenly, they mean by competition the theory of perfect competition. The idea of oligopoly and monopoly, oligopoly, few firms, and monopoly, one firms, as non-competitive comes directly from the idea that of what I call the quantity theory of competition, which is that competition is perfect, is more perfect the bigger the number of firms. This is actually false because the assumption is not the bigger number of firms, but that firms don't care about any others. That is to say, they only consider their own situation, and they believe that what they do cannot affect the market. It is from this framework that you get the idea of barriers to entry, because in order to have perfect competition, firms must be tiny, and if they're tiny, then they must have no scale, and hence any scale is by definition a barrier to entry. Should I stop? Is there a question or problem?
No, I don't know.
Okay,
Well,
you can hear me, right?
Hi, Professor. My name is Ivan, and can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you if you get close.
Basically, I don't see why necessarily the idea of monopoly have to be incompatible with the idea of real competition, because from what I understand, you are saying that what's relevant for the competition is not the number of actors that are supplying something, but is exactly basically the entry barrier, in the sense that the regulating capital, how hard is to reproduce new output of one particular output. So my idea.
But I deny any idea of a barrier to entry. Who is it a barrier to? If I try to buy Trump Towers, there's a barrier of entry. I don't have the money. But Trump doesn't have that, and any big bank will lend you the money to enter if they think it's profitable. So the idea of barrier to entry is already built on the idea that you have to be small and you must leap over this barrier from your own pocket. I deny that there has any meaning to that, given that the mass of capital is available to profitable opportunities. So there's the difficulty. It's not the scale. It's the idea that somehow capitalists cannot get money if there's profit to be made. Let me add something very important empirically. I mentioned in the book that if you look at big capitals, if monopoly was big capital, you would expect big capitals to have profit rates higher than average. But as I point out, it's well known in the business literature too, by the way, the profit rate of big capitals is smaller, but it is more secure. And when you adjust for risk, there's really no difference, except that small capitals have a higher profit rate on average, they have a higher death rate. So this is, for me, evidence of equalization of profit rates, adjusted for risk. I don't know if that answered your question, but I tried to make it clear in the book that the notion of barriers for entry is absolutely tied to the theory of perfect competition, where entry has no barrier if it's infinitesimal, and that has no meaning when you consider that all of capital will look at profitable opportunities. It doesn't have to be in the same industry. Trump can invest, Trump's lawyer can invest in taxis. That doesn't matter. The money didn't come from his pocket. It came from some other people who had lots of money, and banks, by the way, who lend money whenever there's profitable opportunities. So I would urge that people look at the empirical evidence and not, and by the way, I spent a lot of time in the book on the empirical evidence. There really is no evidence that larger firms are more profitable. There is evidence that larger firms have a higher profit margin, not a higher profit rate. But that follows naturally from the equalization of profit rates. The profit rate, by definition, is profit over capital. Profit divided by output is a profit margin. Capital divided by output is a capital output ratio. Well, industries that have higher capital output ratios will have higher profit margins if their profit rates are the same, because the top and the bottom must both be higher if the rate is the same. And that is the reason why profit margins are larger for larger firms. But that follows from the theory of competition also. It has no evidence whatsoever that this is somehow an imperfection. Let me add something about Kaletsky in the empirical work. Kaletsky was not an economist, he was an engineer. And he observed that prices differ across firms, and he observed that some firms have lower costs than others and have higher profit margins. And in order to explain this, he turned to the neoclassical theory of competition, in which all firms are alike, and therefore all firms have the same profit margin. But in neoclassical theory, what he didn't notice or didn't pay attention to is that the cost of a neoclassical firm already includes a normal profit rate. I mentioned that in the book. It comes as a surprise. Most students of economics don't know that the average cost curve includes not only actual cost, but what they call opportunity costs. And opportunity cost is the idea that in general equilibrium, you can always get the normal profit rate. So interestingly enough, what a neoclassical economist would call the average cost curve, a classical economist would call the price of production curve, this variation of the curve with scale. But that means that a profit margin which is normal will already be higher or lower according to capital intensity. And what Kaletsky confused was the actual profit margin with the excess of the profit margin over the normal profit margin. I don't know if it's clear, so not, please ask me. If firms all have equal profit rates, they'll have normal profit margins, which will be higher if the firms are bigger in terms of capital intensity. In order to prove its monopoly, you have to show that the profit margin is bigger than the normal one expected for a firm of that size. And that is exactly what post-Keynesians do not find. Some people like Jan Kregel and others in the post-Keynesian tradition have mentioned that you cannot look at profit margins. You have to look at excess profit margins. But to look at excess profit margins, you identify normal profit margins. And the literature just kind of glosses over that. That's a huge empirical mistake. And it, in fact, explains why the results don't hold up when you look at the profit margins in more detail. So, any other questions about this? Because I want to move to the theory of interest rates, which is an application of the same argument.
My suggested format is that you make your answer for 1 hour, then I say something for 10 minutes, something or less, and then people come to argue with you and you answer, so it's more ordered. We actually have 2 hours, 2 hours and a half, whatever time is needed.
Okay, good. So let me then move on to the interest rate. I structured my presentation around your questions, so I have to redo it a little bit on the fly.
Yeah.
Probably the central theme of the chapters 6 through 11 in the book is to show that the theory of profit rate equalization, when viewed concretely, provides a foundation for the empirical evidence we see, not just abstract, but the empirical evidence we see on relative prices and their relation to their underlying production things. But that also applies to the theory of the exchange rate and the theory of the interest rate. Let me do the theory of the interest rate first. One of the things when I was writing this chapter, and by the way, I have to say that I was struggling with this issue when I ran across Carlo Panico's wonderful book on interest rate theories, and it really was extremely useful for me to see how different economists had dealt with the issue, and Carlo's own attempt to create a Straussian theory of interest rates, which I follow that same attempt, though I come out in a somewhat different way. But I'm a great admirer of his book. And what is very striking is that neoclassical theory and Keynesian theory assume that credit is supplied without cost. Now, this is quite an extraordinary thing, and I think people don't appreciate what that means. If commodities were supplied without cost, you cannot have a cost of supply. If there is no cost of supply, then the only thing that can determine this is the willingness of people to supply, or the risk of supply, and the demand for that product. And that's neoclassical theory and Keynesian theory. Keynes switches from the neoclassicals focus on supply and demand of loanable funds, but there's no cost to loanable funds. And Keynes switches to the supply and demand for liquidity, but there's again no cost of production of the credit of supply. My point is that if you're looking at credit as a capitalist activity, which is indubitably what it is, then you have to understand that banks, finance industries, and all kinds of other bond and equity selling firms and all of that are capitalist enterprises. And they have costs of operation. They have costs for their building. They have costs for their workers. They have costs for their supplies. They have the costs for managing and handling all of their transactions, both deposits and loans and so on. And then it becomes clear that you have to ask, how is the interest rate related as a market price to some underlying price of production? And my answer is, following in effect a Straussian point of view, which is that the interest rate is in fact the price of finance, and the normal interest rate is that which gives a normal profit to the regulating banks, regulating capital. So the principle is exactly the same. But this has one great advantage, which I mentioned in the book. Not only does it provide a theory of the interest rate, which is the same as a theory of all other prices, it explains one important phenomena, which is that the interest rate rises with the price level. The reason is all prices of production are relative prices, including of corn and steel. And as the classical economists knew very well, the market price itself is the relative price times the price level. So we would expect the price of corn in money to go up, even though its relative price may have gone down relative to steel because the inflation would be having an impact. Excuse me. In that same way, the interest rate is a relative price because it depends on money costs. And for that reason, the market interest rate will rise with the price level, just like the price of corn would, the price of steel would. And this explains what's called Gibson's paradox, which is, as Keynes says, the best known empirical phenomena in economics, which is that the interest rate follows the price level, not the rate of change of prices. That's Fisher's argument, which I discuss in the book. Now, it's easy to show that banks can fail. The term bankruptcy comes from the failure of enterprises, including banks, by the way. And it comes because they are unable to make sufficient profit to stay in business. Bank failures are widely known throughout capitalist history, and it comes because profitability is just not sufficient. Banks close their branches, they open branches, they move from one country to another in search of profit. And they are profit-making enterprises like any other. Here what matters is the bank branch, not the ownership. For instance, it may be that a particular capitalist entity, some big combine, may own multiple operations. It may own food chains and clothing stores and banking enterprises and so on. That makes no difference. They operate according to the rules of profitability. And as Jim Clifton pointed out in the Cambridge Journal, in the first issue of the Cambridge Journal, a big enterprise is even more ruthless in weeding out unprofitable entities because it has no commitment to anything except the profit. It doesn't come from a particular region. It's not its personal activity. It's just where the money is, and if it doesn't make profit, it moves away from that. So in that sense, big enterprises are more ruthless appliers of competition. Then the remaining thing is the exchange rate. Now, the traditional way to look at the exchange rate, actually, in Adam Smith, was to say that it was a means of translating local costs, absolute costs, into international prices. Now think about what that means. Adam Smith argues that firms that are lower in cost will be able to sell abroad more cheaply, and that therefore what dominates international trade is absolute costs. Now, at Smith's time, the exchange rates were linked to gold. So it makes it seem as if the translation was straightforward. But in fact, we know, and Smith knew this very well, that the link between a local currency and the gold price changes over time. So his argument was not dependent on that link. And it then raises the question, how does the exchange rate relate to local costs? And the argument I make is, again, a logical extension of the theory of competition, which is that international prices, that prices have to be compared internationally in terms of some common currency. It doesn't matter which currency, because you can always change the unit. But in order for them to be compared across space, they have to be expressed in some common currency. That means that they have to be translated through the exchange rate. But the theory of competition then applied to international prices would give you the same result, as Smith argues, as in a nation, which is that lower cost firms will be more successful. But if that's true, since the international prices are in terms of the exchange rate, that's equivalent to saying that the real exchange rate will be dominated by real costs. In other words, it's Riccardo's solution for relative prices expressed in a Smithian way on the international scale. And what I show is that you can not only formally develop that theoretically, and I won't get into that here, but it's in the book, in Srafa systems and exchange rates reflecting costs, including input costs, you get the idea, you get the answer that the real exchange rates are dependent on real costs of production. And I show that you can actually test this empirically by looking at the real costs, direct and indirect labor costs. I don't have costs, unfortunately, indirect labor costs, because I don't have world input-output tables that are operative for every year over different countries. But I used as a proxy direct unit labor costs. And there's a degree of error in that, clearly. But I showed that that is a very good explanator of real exchange rates, real direct relative labor unit costs in US and Japan, and we did it in after the book in other countries. So again, this brings you back to the cost and profitability part of the story. Now, let me switch to the macro part. For me, the connecting element to the macro part is that at the micro level, firms expand or contract according to the profitability of capital. If the profitability is higher than normal, they move more rapidly into the sphere where the profitability is higher for the regulating capital. But even the regulating capital itself expands or contracts according to whether its profitability is greater than or less than the interest rate, because the interest rate is a benchmark. Now, this is not an argument I invented. It's actually directly in Marx, and it's implicit clearly in Smith and Riccardo, but it's also directly in Keynes. So that means that individual investment functions, so to speak, or the rate of growth of capital, which is the investment divided by the capital stock, individual accumulation functions, depend on profit rates relative to in excess of the interest rate. Now that is exactly Keynes's argument of the marginal efficiency of capital, which is the rate of return on new investment, and the interest rate. So this, for me, connects the argument in the classical tradition on the emphasis of net profitability and the macro question in Keynes on the emphasis of net profitability. Now, notice I'm saying Keynes, not Kalecki. Kalecki actually says something very much like this, but then he skips it over and goes into a simple sort of linear model of profitability, leaving out the interest rate and so on. But for me, this is very important because it creates the foundations for macrodynamics. Keynes deals with the level of the interest rate. But as I point out in the book, you cannot deal with the level of anything in a growing economy. You have to deal with relative prices, not the level of prices. And you have to deal with the relative investment, which is the investment divided by the capital stock, if you want to talk about in a dynamic economy. So the hypothesis is that the growth of capital is a function of the profit rate minus the interest rate. Now that's not a new hypothesis. I said it's in Marx specifically, it's in Keynes implicitly, Joan Robinson builds on it, and so on. But you can then combine it with the argument that the interest rate is a price of production, it's a price of finance, to develop, in effect, the equivalent of an ISLM curve. It's the equivalent because instead of the levels of I and S, you have the rates. Investment divided by the capital stock is the equivalent of the rate of accumulation rather than the level of investment, which is the change in the capital stock. And the S here is a savings propensity. Now, a very important point for me is that another thing that the Kaleckians and Keynesians borrow from neoclassical theory, one thing was the idea of the interest rate as being a costless thing provided by individual preference structures and utility functions or liquidity preference or whatever. The other is the idea that, I lost what I was going to say, hang on. The other is the idea that the savings propensity is based on psychological propensities only, psychological acts. Bassanetti and Caldor and all made the distinction between the savings propensity of workers and the saving propensity of capitalists, but the savings propensity of capitalists as private individuals. What is so striking to me is when I look at the classical literature, I see something very different, which is that they don't talk about the individual propensities to save on psychological basis, they talk about it on structural basis. And here the key propensity to save is that of firms. Firms are at the conference table making the decision on one hand to invest and the decision on the other hand to finance their investment. This is what Kalecki says. But then they cannot have a decision to finance their investment which is independent from the degree of investment. In other words, they cannot be schizophrenic and have one dealt with in one way and the other in another way. And the main point I make there is that if they plan to expand, some degree of that finance will come from their increased business savings, retained earnings. And I show formally that it's sufficient that business retained earnings respond in some degree to the finance gap. For the average savings rate will then become endogenous, regardless of what people do as individuals, because this component will fill any gap left over by individual propensities to save and so on. Not in the immediate sense that it be exact equality, but that it'll move towards filling that gap. Now that means that the savings rate is endogenous, not exogenous. It's not dominated by preferences. It's ultimately regulated by the same firms that make the investment decisions. And that allows you to have a theory of growth of capital dependent on profitability, a theory of growth of capital which responds to capacity utilization, without contradiction, still have a balance between capacity and output in a turbulent sense, and a growth path which responds to the profit rate net of interest. Now, I would argue that that is what Keynes was talking about. It's obviously not what he explicitly says, but he does imply it. In fact, two things are important. One is that he talks about investment as a function of net profitability. The other is that he rejects Kalecki's argument that capacity utilization can be permanently different than what firms desire. And he does so when he rejects Kalecki's paper to the QJE, which I cite in the book. In any case, for me, whether or not Keynes believed this, it's important to note that this makes sense of a huge number of phenomena. And I try to outline the patterns. It makes sense, for instance, of something very important to me. I don't know if I sent this to you or not, but if you go on my homepage, there's a paper I wrote recently, a short piece for a group of economists in England called the Progressive Economics Group, which are getting together ideas of how to actually operate an economy in case someone from the left actually wins an election anywhere. And I made the point that Keynesian theory, basing itself on the short-run argument, divorced the economy from profitability. Even though Keynes himself says that investment depends on net profitability, the Keynesian argument pushes that aside by saying, well, if that's in the long run, in the long run we're all dead. The only thing that's dead in the long run is bad theory. You cannot avoid the question just because you don't have an answer. The implication then is that if Keynesian stimulus creates an increase in employment, and if this increase of employment shrinks the reserve army of labor, then as we well know empirically, that shrinking of the reserve army of labor will cause wages to rise more rapidly. Now, they could be falling, so they'll fall less rapidly, but the key critical point is if they rise relative to productivity. If they do that, then the profit rate will fall. It may fall anyway because of the capital output ratio, but it'll fall faster. and if profitability is falling, it'll undermine the incentive for growth, and that will undermine the stimulus. And I show in the book how a stimulus can cause a bump, a jump in output and employment, and move you to a new growth path. But that growth path depends on profitability, and the profitability is undermined, then the growth path will decay. That is to say, it'll rise more slowly, and you may end up undermining the stimulus in the first place. Now, in this little piece, which is on my homepage, I make the point that this was actually something that Keynesians should have noticed, because if they looked at the first instance of Keynesian economics, which is sorry, I had a phone call. The first instance of Keynesian economics, which was the application by Hitler to large-scale finance, often called, I think Kaletsky calls it the first application of military Keynesianism. It's a resounding success from a point of view of stimulus. They deficit financed, they reduced unemployment, which was very high, brought it down to zero, and in a similar way, Roosevelt did the same thing in the United States, reduced unemployment through the war effort, which was deficit financed, and yet you got no substantial inflation. Profitability actually rose rather than fell. Growth was enormously high. And yet when the same policies that worked for World War II and Hitler's sort of expansion, and expansion in many countries in World War II, these same policies were applied in the post-war period, they didn't work. Why? Because in the earlier periods of the war effort, wages and prices and interest rates were controlled, what Keynesians call price controls. They were not allowed to rise even though the economy got tighter, because that was against the war effort. And so wages rose very little, productivity rose, so the wage share fell, and profitability rose. You can track it, the profit rate in Germany in the 1930s. You can track the profit rate in the US in the post-war period, during the war period in the 1940s. In the 1970s, in the 1940s, after the war, 50s and 60s, all capitalist countries applied the same principles, and it didn't work. After a period of stimulus, they began to get inflation, and they got slower growth, and that was a famous period called stagflation. I show empirically in the book, and I also show it, I mentioned it in the paper, that this was a period in which the link between stimulus and profitability was not cut as it was through wage and price controls, and instead what you got was rising wage share and falling profitability and falling growth, and then the stimulus became more and more inflation in an effort to combat the unemployment rising because the growth was slowing down. There was more stimulus, which caused more inflation and a temporary reduction in unemployment, and it came back. And that was exactly the question that allowed Friedman to come in and say, look, you Keynesians don't understand your own theory. In fact, I can explain those phenomena from the point of neoclassical theory, and that led to the Friedman and Phelps revolution, which really destroyed neoclassical economics. Keynesian economics. I was a graduate student at that time, in 1967, and I saw how Keynesians were running around, desperately trying to explain why the so-called Phillips curve no longer worked. But they had no link between stimulus and profitability in their own theory, which is a tremendous irony, because there's no way, in my opinion, that Keynes would have made this error, that he would have forgotten the other side. Now, this is not an issue of long run and short run. This is an issue of slow and fast processes. My colleague, Lance Taylor, who is a brilliant economist, has admitted recently that you can have profit-led growth and wage-led growth. But I think that's a mistake to separate those two as separate regimes. When you stimulate an economy, you get growth which leads to wage increases. So that looks like wage-led growth. if the wage increases are so high as to reduce profitability, then you get a decline associated with a falling profit rate, and that looks like profit-led decline. But that is simply a temporal sequence. It is not something that could happen either one or the other, except in the sense that if wages don't rise greater than productivity, you may not have a profit-led decline. I argue in this paper that that's exactly what you see in Brazil. That Brazil and Lula did wonderful things with stimulus and inequality reduction, but they also had falling profitability, and as a result, they ended up having stagnation and unemployment rising, and their additional stimulus went more and more into inflation. We can talk more about that if you want. I haven't talked much here about development, and I don't talk much in the book about that, but let me just say, remind people that the reason I don't do that is that I believe that if you're going to talk about the international economy and development, you have to have the foundation of how it works in the center, because the powerful forces are really in the center, and development is really the introduction of countries into the world market. So you have to have a theory of the world market itself. Let me end, I'm a good time to stop now, but let me end by saying what I started with, that I really want to emphasize that I am not at all interested in correcting Kaleckian theory or neoclassical theory. I'm interested in a different foundation. And I believe that there is such a foundation. I believe it can be shown, and more importantly, I believe it can be developed. So let me just mention one little further development, since I mentioned it just briefly in the book. But it's what I'm working on, literally what I'm working on right now. It's probably the oldest, sorry, I keep getting calls and I don't know what they was. Hang on a second. One of the oldest empirical studies about distribution of income come from Pareto. In the 1870s, I think it is, that Pareto was asked to tabulate the incomes of large estates. And he found that they follow a law, a distribution law, which is a power law. And that power law is now called the Pareto law. It's a simple mathematical function, and he found the data fit that function very well. Economists then began to think, well, that was a universal law, and they applied it to distribution of income. But they found that as the distribution of income began to encompass more and more people, that law did not work except for the top part. Now, this turns out to be not surprising, because the people that Pareto was originally looking at, the incomes of the rich, who had enough income to be taxed, had a different law than the incomes of working class people, wage and salary income, which turned out to follow a different law. And in the 2000s, a physicist by the name of Viktor Yakovenko looked at the distribution of income overall, and he saw what we did not see as economists, that Pareto was right for the top 1 to 3%, but the bottom 97% was a different distribution, an exponential distribution. Now, Yakovenko tries to explain this by saying, well, an exponential distribution is a distribution which follows an additive law, well known in physics, and a power law is one that comes from a multiplicative law. Now, additive means that wages are proportional to your labor time, which is a flow, so it's a flow law, whereas your employment time, whereas property income is proportional to your stock of assets, so it's a multiplicative law. He never quite explains that very well. He tries as a physicist to explain it, but those models are really not models of economics. However, a group of us here at the News Group have been working on a proposition, which I think we've proved, and I need to write it up, which is that the equalization of wages produces an exponential distribution of income. For those of you who have the math, basically if you take Adam Smith's idea that wages are low in one region and high in another, then workers will move from the low region to the high region in a kind of slow and erratic way. That's called diffusion in physics. And that'll bring wages down where they're high and bring wages up where they're low. However, if you see this as a process with no noise in it, then wages will be equalized. If you think of it as a process subject to random shocks or any other kinds of shock, then astonishingly, the distribution of income settles into a particular distribution, which is exactly the one you observe, which is exponential. In a similar way, if you look at the equalization of profit rates, and you think of it as a pure process with no shocks, then you get equalization of profit rates. If, however, you look at it as a process which involves diffusion and shocks, then you get a distribution of profitability, which is exactly what we observe, a kind of Laplace distribution. Now, this, in my opinion, is how you should proceed when you're confronting phenomena that have not been explained. You go back to the basics. Instead of inventing a new phase of capitalism, which only you have seen, and which you throw in as a modifier due to some imperfections, you should ask yourself, have you understood fully the implications of the existing theory? And this is a way that when you move to the more concrete level, you can explain something very powerful, which is the distribution of income in every capitalist country. I have a paper on my homepage called Vast Majority Income, in which we show that applying this principle, we can explain the patterns in every country for which we have data on the World Bank database, which is basically every country in the world. Now that's pretty astonishing, and yet the application is simple and clear, and you don't need to learn very much math. In fact, you don't need to know any math to do it. You can follow it pretty straightforward. So let me stop there and now open it up to your debate and questions.
Okay. Now what I suggest.
I'm sorry, your voice is going in and out.
Yeah, that's the same. We are trying to understand. Now you listen.
Now I can hear. Now I can hear.
Okay.
Yes.
My suggestion, also for technical reason, is that now we shift the camera. I'll do 10, maximum 15 minutes comments, more than questions. Then the students that wishes to dialogue with you come here where I am, so
okay.
we can discuss.
Okay.
First of all, I want to start with the thank you to the students, because I think you may imagine the difficulty in these times to study non-mainstream texts, beginning from a curriculum, both in the undergraduate and in the graduate, which does not give them the basics. So to go back to the basics in the way you mean it is particularly difficult today. And I was really impressed and admired by the students that they chose your book, and they did a quite serious job on the chapters they chose. I also want to thank the other professors that came here and chose another chapter. Now, you know, here there was Gary Dimsky, we did a different thing. It was a sort of beginning in which we told the students how we both became the path, how we became non-mainstream theories. But then there was Jan Toporowski, then there was Joe Michel, then there was Cedric Durand. There were a lot of people, and they contributed also, some of them contributed to the questions. But second, I want to thank you personally, because I told you that already, but probably it does not appear enough in my writings, but I began to study economics in 73, 74, and for at least a decade you were one of the 3-4 people that very much influenced me, and later on I continued to follow you. I'm not thinking that we agree in any sense about everything, but for sure it has been a powerful influence, and I'll say in a couple of minutes where probably some constant and dissent may be. A first point is the way you started saying that positing the questions in the existing framework means to remain in the existing framework, and I completely agree with you. But I would like to tell you how I begin the course of the substantially on the history of economic thought, which is in the first undergraduate year. It's a very strange thing that it happens so, no? Because this course was cancelled, now it is there again, and probably may disappear. And I am particularly happy about that, you know, because it's better to influence people's mind from the beginning, in a sense. In my first lecture, I tell them that there are different ways of looking, of sustaining the importance of the history of economic thought, you know. And of course the mainstream view is exactly the idea that there is a continuity and you look backwards to the other theories as an history of errors to be corrected. Of course all the critical perspectives break with this idea of reading backwards in the history of economic thought. But I am a fan of the idea of reading backwards in the meaning that was given by Rafa when he did his lectures in 2730, and I think this meaning is not very far from yours. It is actually the same, in my view, in Marx, in Schumpeter, maybe even in Keynes and Bauer. The idea is that you don't think that the present situation in economic theory is a settled one. There are problems which are open. The key point is to understand where the problems are and go back and interrogate the old theories about that. This is what actually Marx did in the theories of surplus value. This is what Schumpeter did in the history of economic analysis, and this is, in my view, the right way to do. So it is important that the students know from the beginning of a course of economics that they are in a contested territory where there are problems to be solved. And so you are not a good economist if you don't know that. This is the first thing I would like to say. The second thing that is directly related to this, and here maybe there is some slight difference, slight or not slight, I don't know, with you, is that what are the questions that in a sense are more urgent and at the same time that are not settled. One is, of course, and this is Marx's idea, the grounding of the notion of surplus value. So a contested terrain is the theory of value, but the second one is the theory of money, and the third one is the theory of competition. And in a sense, the notion of equilibrium is at the intersection of the all three. Now, your influence on me comes directly from the notion of real competition, which was your contribution from my point of view since the first writings of yours, you know. Say the notes on Dobb, the criticism of the Dobb's theory and all that. the point about money, so in a sense, though you probably would not agree with that, your influence was one of the influences that put me on the direction to study Schumpeter. Another one was Rosa Luxemburg, because Rosa Luxemburg, I was very much influenced by the introduction to political economy. Not only the book, and the introduction to political economy, she actually has some hints at a theory of competition. But the other point is money. Money, I think there is the key distinction is between endogenous and exogenous money, and the challenge for me is that value theory must be linked in an inseparable and essential way to the notion of real competition and to the notion of endogenous money. The second thing led me to Keynes. And to some particular Keynesian authors and circuit theory and all that. Now, this maybe is a question in a sense. You say that you want to link the classical tradition, and when you speak of classical tradition, you speak of Marx, but also Smith and Riccardo on one side, and you add Keynes. You know, the problem is that Keynes are many Keynes. My impression is that the Keynes before the general theory, the Keynes of the Treatise of Money, is a rich author and it is mostly discarded. The Keynes of the general theory is a great theorist, but it is very confused theorist. By the way, I completely agree, if I understood well, with your criticism, which is so fashionable among some Keynesians and some so-called new Kaleskian of the idea of a wage-led growth. I don't agree with that as a sensible theory. Wages are following, in a sense, even if you are a true Keynesian, if you are a true Kaleskian. So one problem is which Keynes. The other impression that I have is that you are very, very kind towards Smith and Riccardo, in the sense that you are attributing to them more insights that I think they had. I think that Marx, in a sense, broke with them, both on the link value and money, and on the notion of real competition. Yes, there is some hints about real competition in Riccardo, but you know, it's like comparing a very young boy, even a baby, to an adult if you compare Riccardo and Marx on that. But that's something, of course, to be discussed. Just a couple of quick things on minor. The last thing is about equilibrium. I think you are very important in stressing the turbulence of the notion of equilibrium, because if you go linking those things, the theory of value, endogenous money, and real competition, the notion of equilibrium must be changed. I would probably go a bit farther than you, in the sense that, you know, I studied economics with Claudio Napoleoni when he was a Marxian, and he stressed the idea that in Marx value notion there was equilibrium and non-equilibrium. It is something that confusedly, I think, David Harvey is trying to say when he speaks of anti-value. I don't know if I am wrong, but I think that you very much stress the out of equilibrium path to equilibrium, and that's crucial in my view, no? And that's really the point. Either one stress these 4 points together: value surplus value, linked with money, linked with real competition, and going towards a different notion of equilibrium, or is not really going towards a new foundation. This is a problem that I have with the movement of rethinking economics. We have a couple of them who are here, very, very valid and courageous students. But you know, I think that they're asking for pluralism is not enough. You know, pluralism is of course needed. It's a good ethic of discourse and good ethics of teaching. You know, the point is for me is the plurality. So Marx was not a pluralist. He wanted to be the new foundation beyond Riccardo. Schumpeter was not a pluralist. He proposed himself as a new foundation relatively to Barras. And Keynes was not a pluralist, you know. He said that the particular theory was Marshallian and neoclassical theory. His was the new general theory. So we are not asking to have a place as a heterodox. We should ask to be the new orthodoxy. So heretics may be a different good word. You know, we will never succeed. But if one does not try, he will never succeed. Just a couple of points, and then I leave the video to the students. I think that Baran and Sweezy have certainly limits, and then when they wrote the Monopoly Capital, their problem was to impress students trained in neoclassical economic theory. They were posing a problem. Kaleski is a bit better, but here the real author, and I don't think you never discuss him in your book, is Silos Labini. You probably know my friend Joseph Alevi from the New School. He is the real guy, you know, because he is in the monthly review tradition, but he looks for the foundation, and the Kaleskian tradition, but he looks for the foundation of oligopoly theory in Silos Labini. And the last, if there is a last point, no, I think I said, you know, I just name it because there I think we are on very different sides of the barricade. I respect Carlo Panico, he's a friend, but I think that the theory of banking is good theory of banking is not one that treats banks as firms like any other. You know, that the point of banking is exactly the opposite. They are a completely different kind of animal. And the right abstraction for a monetary, true monetary economy is the one in which their function is not so much to make profit, but to provide capital in the Schumpeterian sense to firms, to innovating firms who are allowing the real competition among firms. You know that there is an entry by Schumpeter, Capitalism, in which he says, what characterizes capitalism? Free market, private property. The two things, you know, may be interpreted along Hayekian ways. Then there is the third point. The third point is the banking system. And why the banking system? Because the banking system breaks free competition and private property so that innovation could go into a system. Otherwise, in a free competition system, in a private property system, you would not have Schumpeter's kind of real competition. My suggestion is that now I ask the students that want to either do further questions or intervene on your speech. I start with
just make a few comment, because otherwise I may repeat myself.
Okay.
Just to, I mean, I thank you for those comments, and we obviously have a tremendous amount of overlap. So I have taught and continue to teach history of economic thought. My mentor was Robert Halberner. In fact, the irony is I became a heterodox economist because I read Bob Halberner's book when I was in graduate school. It was a course given by a business school professor, because economics department at Columbia did not teach history of economic thought, and that professor got fired from the business school. So keeping history of economic thought alive has been really fundamental to my life. When I read other economists, I ask myself two questions. One, as you said, is what's the problem? What's the question? But for me, I'm always aware of how the question is posed and what the empirical evidence is. If it's a question within a theory, then I'm aware of the fact that the question is shaped and possibly fundamentally motivated by the theory itself. Like reswitching is an example of that kind of question. And I always ask myself, what's the empirical evidence? My early training as an engineer led me to believe that science proceeds by an interaction between the theory and the object of its investigation. So I've always had a tremendous interest in that. I agree that money is endogenous, absolutely. I agree that Marx at least is the one who lays out most formally the theory of value and surplus value. But let me just make two quick points on that. First, I argue in the book, and I believe this to be true, that Marx knew perfectly well that profit was not only from surplus value. And he could not have been ignorant of it because he cites already Stewart in a positive way. But Stewart is merely reflecting a well-known theme in economics that profit of merchant capital, especially pre-industrial capital, before modern capitalism, was enormous and for thousands of years, and that was not based on surplus value. It was based on transfer, buying cheap and selling dear. And I try to make that point that though Marx never put together those two elements, he clearly states his intention to do so, and it is our responsibility to do so. And I try and show in the book, for finance, that plays a very important role, that profitability can come from capital gains and all of those things that we know so well, but they're not that they have no limits, but that rather they're regulated by the same principles, but they are different. Yes, I agree about equilibrium and its turbulence. For me, disequilibrium is a means to equilibration. It's an aspect of equilibration. So I don't like the idea of equilibrium and disequilibrium. How can that be? They are simply two phases of a process of regulation. And that's why I prefer the term turbulent regulation. Money is endogenous, yes, Marx, but that, I get that from Marx. Right away in theories of, in the contribution to critique, and also in volume 1, but much more in the contribution to critique, Marx emphasizes again and again, even if money was purely gold, not even currency, it would be endogenous. And I try to make that point in the book, that endogeneity of money is not a discovery. It is, in fact, an old debate between the banking school and the orthodoxy of the day, and Marx is very clearly in the endogenous money side. You may be right that I'm too kind to Smith and Riccardo, but I'm not really trying in the book to lay out what Smith and Riccardo said. I'm trying to lay out their contribution to a set of ideas which show up again in Marx. And this I can defend, that he takes from them some things which are essential to his argument, and that I have elaborated, and he leaves out other things which are essential to his argument also. So I try to bring those back. Possibly the point where we do disagree, I don't think there's any disagreement there, is that the question of banks. I agree that the function of banks is to provide the means for capitalism to expand and grow. This is Wicksel's point and Schumpeter's, but that is a different question than the motivation of banks. Capitalists don't go into banking to keep capitalism growing. They go into banking to make money, the same way they go into anything else. One could argue that's a function of steel to make capitalism possible, because without it, you wouldn't have machinery. But that's not the motivation. And so for me, the banking enterprise has to be treated in terms of its profitability motivation. And I can show, and it's easy to show, that bankruptcies have a lot to do with profitability. Banks fail repeatedly, not because they don't provide their function, but because they cannot maintain their condition of existence, which is profitability. The last point is rethinking economics. Yes, I'm not a fan of the rethinking economics movement as it is being conducted, because it's based on the premise that these people who are rethinking it, no one has thought it before. I find that annoying at the very least, and insulting at a personal level. But the difficulty for me is that they conflate pluralism, which I fought my whole life to maintain. If you look at my interventions at the New School over my 47 years that I've been there, it has been to make sure that we have post-Keynesians and Straussians and Kaleckians and Marxists and institutionalists, so that we can expose our students to the variety of ideas and variety of questions, by the way. Feminists, people working on race, I have fought for and supported these my whole life. But that does not mean that I support eclecticism. And there I agree very much with what you said, Riccardo, which is that economic theory has to have a consistent and coherent foundation. It cannot be a series of patchworks that you add on to another theory. If you're going to be consistent, you either within the other theory and modifying it, or you have to step outside of it. So I think, as you said, this is what Schumpeter tried to do, this is what Marx tried to do, certainly what Smith and Riccardo tried to do, and in my opinion, this is what Keynes tried to do. Of the two, Keynes and Marx are the least finished. Marx laid out this grand agenda, and it didn't even finish anything beyond volume 1. And we know the rest was put together by Engels. So it's a mess, patches here and there. And Keynes, as we know, rushed through the general theory, then devoted his life to the empirical political implications. And I think had he gone back and thought about his own argument, he would have come up with a different construction, not the different argument, but different relations, including, especially for me, the important relation, which he notes but doesn't follow up on, which is a relation between stimulus and profitability. So let me stop there. I greatly appreciate this opportunity to talk to you, and I appreciate, Riccardo, that you have been open to this, because I can tell you that many people that I've encountered have not been open to this kind of dialogue.
Okay, now, please present yourself.
All right. Hi, my name is Mehdi Shogi. I come from Iran, and I'm a participant in the reading group. I appreciate your intervention today. Thank you very much. My question is, I make a comment and try to present a question, because for me, an essential element of the money theory that has to be addressed is whether, and that is also an issue of endogeneity of money.
I'm sorry, I missed a word. It cut out. Go back, and you started to say whether there was something, and then the voice cut out. So say that again.
Anyway, whether we want to address the question of endogeneity of money, and also I try to present it in a perspective of the history of economic thought through the interpretation Marx started to develop, maybe didn't go far enough in his critique of the debate between the banking school and the currency school. So it's the question of a pure credit economy. Of course, Marx has a very peculiar commodity theory of money through gold, but I think there is the possibility of an interpretation and going beyond Marx of a pure credit And when you are talking about a pure credit of money, then automatically the banking system would present itself as a separate and fundamental entity, as a grounding force of capitalism, which makes capitalism possible, makes profitability possible. So it has an infrastructural status to it. Of course, the motive of profit will also function inside the banking system, but the nature of its action would be quite different from a business that is reliant on the banking system and needs credit to be conceded to it by the banking system. And then the question of the state is very much bound to the function of the banking system, because the banking system historically then developed into a hybrid system, but at the heart of the issue is the question of the pure credit system and having a banking system which is quite different as a sector to the rest of the economy, which provides the liquidity and the credit necessary. In order to be able to do this, and I think that there are the seeds of this in Marx too. He distinguishes between banks and moneyed capital. And here there is also, I think, a kind of inconsistency in Carlo Panico's theory when he tries to resolve his equations. Of course, I am also referring to a paper by Messori and Chiodi of 1984, which they try to critique the 1980s theory of article by Panico in Cambridge Journal of Economics, and they underline this inconsistency in between the interest paid on deposits and the interest paid on loans, the interest rate, long-term interest rate, which Panico has to disentangle, saying the interest paid on loans is not connected to the interest paid on deposits, which in his system as a pure intermediary banking system is not very realistic as a presupposition. So I think this goes back to the fundamental difference of the banking system. And this has to be also addressed in a theory of competition, but maybe the challenge is actually to understand how real competition acts inside the banking system without making it, from the process point of view, totally equal or let's say resembled to the firm sector minus banks, let's say non-financial sector. How it does act inside the financial and banking sector, it's an open question to me, but I think it has to be fundamentally different. Anyway, I made a long comment.
Thank you for the comment.
You
know, if I may, I mean, it's easier for me to answer comments one at a time, because otherwise I lose track. I don't believe in the concept of a pure credit system. I think that comes about already from a misrepresentation of how banks operate and a misrepresentation of what other economists have said about banking. Now, this is what we do as economists. We say, well, you know, Adam Smith was not as clever as me. Because when I read Adam Smith, I see he clearly didn't understand this, and I have now solved Adam Smith's problem, and I've invented a whole new framework. I take this with great skepticism. And that same thing applies to Marx, except there's a problem with Marx, is that he didn't finish his damn work. he had set out an agenda to develop his theory and argument step by step, never introducing a more concrete thing until all the implications of a particular level of abstraction. And for that reason, he abstracts from credit because he says, I will deal with it later. He's dead at that point. He never does deal with it. So when we look at Marx, we don't see the beautiful urn that he planned to create. We see the one that he dropped in all the pieces, and then we say, I like this piece, but this piece doesn't make sense to me. And this one here, I don't know what this is about. And part of my task, I taught a course called Reading and Using Capital, which I didn't invent, I inherited it at the New School. I taught it for 20 years. And what we did is we had 1 year of reading 3 volumes of Capital in a prior course, which was just to get an idea of what was going on. And then in my course, we started to put the urn back together, the pieces back together, show how they're connected, what's missing. And I found that that was enormously useful because it showed a coherence that you cannot get from picking up pieces. The traditional use of Marx is what I think of as a soup. You throw in lots of bits of everything in the soup, and then you fish out this thing. That's a piece of meat I like, that's a piece of fish I like, and then I go with that. I think that's not fair to Marx. It's not representative. Now, what is a pure credit system? I don't think any such things can exist in capitalism. Banks' existence depends on their ability to make profits. This, I think, is easy to show. So if you as a theorist deny that, then you're denying a reality. I mean, I don't mean you personally, but theorists do this all the time. Banking system is something different. Why is that? Well, because I don't know how to deal with it. That's not a reason. My theory doesn't deal with it. That's not a reason. You didn't mention, for instance, Lapovica and Ito's book, which is an attempt to sort of make sense of Marx. When they come to money dealing capital, they say, well, they stand outside of the sphere of capital. Why is that? Well, because they couldn't figure out how to integrate. I know both of them very well. Ito is an old friend of mine, for instance. I think that's the wrong way. Even if it's not in Marx, and much of it is in Marx, at least in preparation for the question, you have to ask, what do banks do? Not what their function is, not what their effect is. First, what do they do? And the answer is very clear. They make money. That's their purpose. So if they don't make money, they fail. And you can write a list of banks that fail every year. It's actually a published list. It's a bank failure rate. You can look it up. Now, then the question becomes more concrete things. I'm not a follower of Panico. I praise Carlo because I thought his book, the strongest part of his book was the question. How do you integrate the theory of banking with the theory of surface price of production? I think it was a wonderful question. I answered it differently. If you read my response, you see it's different from his. So I agree that there are criticisms one can make. In effect, I made a criticism of his solution. But what I liked about it was posing of the question. And here I tried to make the point that there is, let me say something else. Hicks also did the same thing. He also proposed a theory of profit rate equalization for banking, but he could not come up with a theory of interest on deposits. And because of that, he then did a kind of cute thing, which is the interest on deposits is based on liquidity preference, a la Keynes. And then everything else is what he called in and out rates are all based on profit rate equalization. In the book, I make the point that you cannot leave the interest and deposits out of the picture because the interest is paid by somebody. It's paid by an enterprise that takes your money in and pays you money. It has to pay it out of its profits. Where's it going to come from? And I make the further point that the original interest on deposits was from goldsmiths. Goldsmiths took your money, whether it's coins or paper money and all that, and they held it for you because it was a safe place. The original Bank of Amsterdam for 100 years was just a place that you didn't pay interest. It charged you a fee, so it had a negative interest rate. But that fee was based on its costs. Its fee was the cost, the amount of money it had to charge you in order to make profit. The Bank of Amsterdam was a profit-making enterprise. So there's no difficulty, theoretically or empirically, in explaining the interest rate on deposits. And when you do that, you have the whole system within the same logic. And I think that's not a trivial solution. I totally agree that credit has a big impact. In the macro section, I emphasize this a lot. But I don't think that the state determines the credit system, it manipulates it. And it does so in a variety of ways, which are very well known, we know that. But you cannot understand that manipulation if you don't have an adequate theory of banking. The key point for me is a transition from commodity-based money, whether it's fixed or flexible exchange rate, so-called convertible, inconvertible tokens. That makes extremely clear that's just a fixed or flexible exchange rate with gold. And there are laws to that relation. But fiat money is different because it's printed by the state. And the bank credit depends on that inexhaustible resource that the state can print. Then the question arises, what are the limits? If the state can print money, why can't it just everything in capitalism be wonderful? And the answer is because there are consequences. And that for me is another issue of theory. And the chapter on inflation is all about modern inflation, which is fiat money inflation. Argentina's inflation rates of several thousand% a month came about precisely because the state had no limit on the printing of money, but it doesn't follow that there are no limits. It just means the limits get displaced. So I would urge you to go back and look at the theory of credit that you think is wrong and specify that you've actually got it from the originals rather than the received versions, which are, as economists, we all have this tendency to say that no one was as smart as we are. I just absolutely don't believe that. I really think that we're dumber, that economics has been an entropy process of degradation over 100 years. So we should reverse that and say, look, let me assume that I need to understand more. Now let me stop there. Thank you for the comment.
Thank you.
Okay. Now there is Ivan Invernizzi, the guy before. Please, the other students, raise your hand if you wish to intervene.
Good afternoon, Professor. Well, actually, it's morning there, I think.
No,
And,
it's mostly.
well, first of all, I thank you for something which is very rare for my experience in the academics, is your audacity. So you are not just looking forward to find, let's say, people agreeing with you. You are looking forward to build something which is relevant historically. So that means that you respect the science you are dealing with. And this is, I think, really rare, and historically, it means that basically you recognize an historical role and not just an empirical role. And a priori, from the content of your theory, this is really something I respect deeply and is so rare. And so thank you for also saying what you said, that you have to have the audacity to step out from a framework that you think is wrong, not just to put an ad hoc adjustment, because the science, I mean, proceed also with scientific revolution, and if you see that there is a fundamental problem with a framework, you need to be brave enough to try to change it completely. So thank you very much, and in fact I think that your real competition concept framework is the main, like, the gold and the more precious contribution of your book. I mean, at least at the moment, from my understanding, this is really a precious contribution. And personally, I think that I will exploit it in my career or production in the future, in the sense that, well, I have something like, I don't know, 50 years of living expectancy. So I think that I will do something, and I think I will exploit it. And so I'm really looking forward also to maybe have some interaction with you in future on this ground. And then more specifically, my question, which I hope to be able to frame it in a consistent way, but is the following. Don't you think that could be a connection between the length of life of a capital in a sector, of fixed capital in sector, and the speed of equalization of this sector with the other. Like, for example, you have sector like energetic sector in which the capital have a really, really long life. So the dead labor embodied in the capital stay there a lot. And I suppose, my intuition, I suppose that in those sectors there should be longer time before there is an equalization than other sectors that use more, a capital which is replaced faster, or that use a more little capital intensity. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. That's a very good question. Let me begin by saying what you said earlier. Science is a process of puzzles. And if you're a physicist, you understand that most of the questions that have occurred to you haven't been solved. If you're a biologist, you see the same thing. What unites a physicist and a biologist is that they have to solve the problem in such a way that it doesn't contradict other solutions, or else they have to abandon the foundation. You cannot, as a physicist, invent ether like they tried to do earlier to explain a phenomena that Einstein ultimately explained in a different way. And so they're constrained puzzles. And so the constraint is how to make sense of how to make sense of this in light of what we already know makes sense. And that's reasonable. So your question about the durability of capital speed of equalization, I make use of that to explain a different phenomenon. So, and your point may be absolutely valid, so let me come back to that. But the different phenomena is that if it takes a long time for capital to turn over, then there is a tendency for the adjustment of process to be done more through utilization of capacity and less through price. Because the price adjustment comes about because of the pressure of new entry. You don't lower your own price, or if the profit rate is high, that doesn't make any sense. You eliminate your own profit rate. You lower your own price because of the threat or actuality of the entry. And the entry is going to be more cautious if the entrants have to commit themselves for a longer time. So I do make this point that you expect to see a less price adjustment and more capacity utilization. Your point is therefore, I didn't think of it in those terms, but it seems to me correct, that therefore also the price adjustment itself will be slower because the pressure for that will be absorbed through capacity utilization adjustments. Now profitability may still adjust because both affect profitability, capacity and price, capacity utilization and price, but that's an empirical question. And off the top of my head, it seems very plausible to me, but I have not done the research myself, and I look forward to research being done on that. I want to mention one thing. It's very important to generate questions like this, like your question, and like the prior question of the role of credit and all that. But one lesson I've learned over time is that I try to understand the question in terms of the context, and I try to step away from the question, if I can, to see if there's another way to approach the issue, because a question is often formulated in terms of the theory.
Yeah.
And in order to train myself to see the question independently of the way that it is actually posed, I study magic. Now, by magic, I mean what's called stage magic, should we call real magic. It's a construction of an illusion, because all the construction in magic is using scientific principles to construct something which is not what is not real. And many phenomena that we observe in practice have a magical element to them in that they appear to be something that contradicts the underlying thing. But if you are a magician, you know perfectly well that what you just constructed is fully 100% based on the laws of physics and biology and all that. There's no mystery, there's no special thing. They're just representations of reality in a way that appear puzzling. And I train myself to same thing. When someone says to me, well, it's well known that this X is true, I want to know whether it is well known and how it is well known, and how I can rethink that before I begin the answer. And that's a slow process, because you have to look at the empirical evidence too, but you also have to look at the theory that they're coming from, which is interpreting the reality. That's an abstract answer, but it's amazing how well that works if you approach things that way. So I thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you for the answer, and looking forward to stay in touch in order to develop on this basis.
Okay, thank you.
Now we have the last student making you questions. Then I have one, and then we could close the meeting.
Hi, I'm Berta. I'm a student here in Bergamo at the Master. Thank you, first of all, thank you for your time, and thank you for answering all of our questions. Thank you for your contribution. And my question is about chapter 16. As you probably know, we divided the book and we presented, each of us presented one chapter. And my chapter was chapter 16, the one that I chose. So when it came to the policy implications considerations, I questioned myself, and actually in class we were having a discussion. If you would suggest or have in mind any other policies other than the standard fiscal or monetary policies, or even increasing the wage share kind of policies, or decreasing the interest rate compared to the profit rate, something that really has to do with real competition, some policies that would deal with the inherent characteristics of competition. That's my question.
Yes, thank you. Let me just see if I get that question correct. But I did mention at the beginning that one of the striking things I saw about the failure of Keynesian policy was that it didn't take into account the price and wage effects of stimulus. But there was a policy that it made that possible, which is price and wage controls, which are usually in wars. In wars, you can motivate the population, and including the capitalist class, by the way. You can say to them, I'm sorry, you cannot do what you would normally do in a free market because we're suspending the free market for social reasons. And that worked. So the irony is that Keynesian stimulus policies worked best when the free market was suspended. Interest rates, prices, and wages were all controlled. And if you look at the history of people who tried to do this, they recognized that this was important. I mean, you look at the central bankers who wrote all about this in the US, and you look at people who wrote about Germany, they recognized that this was a way to make the stimulus succeed. So that's an intervention, but it's an intervention against the normal functioning of the market. Another intervention, which is always, we recognize everywhere, are environmental and other safety and other controls, because the market drives towards maximum profit, and maximum profit can involve much destruction, havoc of all sorts. And so all societies have built in limits to what profit is allowed to do. The growth of the labor movement is another historic policy, in this case from the working class itself, but pushed through the state. So that I didn't spend much time on that because the book was already exceedingly long, but it's very clear that the history of capitalism is the history of the struggle against the free market, against the market let loose. I wanted to first show how the free market would function in order to get the grounding of why you need interventions of all sorts. Issues of discrimination. It pays capitalists to discriminate. Absolutely, because they get cheaper labor that way. If they can support racism or sexism, that's not something imperfect. It's not something, an externality. That's an absolute internality. And our frequent historical interventions are to go against things which are internal to the market. But to understand that, we need to have an understanding of why they are internal. So for me, that was very important. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes.
Whether you had something more specific in mind.
No, I think this answers my question.
I think we should give capitalism more credit. It's a system of great benefit and great rottenness. And those two come from the same incentive structure. And if we don't understand that, we're always saying the good part is the internal, which is the fiction that neoclassical theory tries to propagate. The internalities are good and the externalities can be bad. Absolutely false. Internality and externality, good and bad, are joined together. And that step outside of the question is a step like saying, in magic, no, that elephant really did not disappear. We have to then ask, where's the elephant?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to Berta Vallesi, my questions, problems became two. I start from the one that came to my mind while Berta was talking and listening to your answer. I agree with you that we should not underestimate capitalism. At the same time, I think that capitalism has its limits. And what do I mean with that? If I look for criticism of Keynesianism, somehow even touching some of your points, strangely, two people come to my mind. Probably because it was in the years I was studying economics. One is, and one would say, Keynesians. One is John Robinson, and the other is Hai Minsky. John Robinson in '72 published I think a lecture she did at the ASSA in '71 called The Second Crisis of Economic Theory. If you read it, it's incredible how hard she is against the Keynesians, the way the message of Keynes was put in practice. But if you look at it, there is also behind that an implicit criticism of Keynes. The idea that a generic push to demand unqualified is enough, and behind that there is explicitly the problem of distribution, but also implicitly the problem of the composition of output, which is driving capitalism, even in the so-called golden age. Then let us go to Hyman Minsky. The last two chapters of John Maynard Keynes, the book of '75, that nobody reads.
Nobody reads, right?
If one goes there, it's strange because he is very hard with Keynes. When he takes up the idea of socialization of investment, he says that Keynes was too timid, that Keynes was a radical in the 20s and a conservative in the 30s,
Yeah.
that the idea of Keynes is that once we reach the full employment, neoclassical theory is enough, the market rightly allocates according to rationality, rational choice, and all that. And he is very hard against that. And he even says that the high profit, high employment model of this so-called golden age created a social nightmare and we would say today ecological disaster. So why I'm raising this? Because when I go to conferences after the 2007-2008 crisis, what I see that Marxists, when they go into economic policy proposals, are very, very timid.
Are very what, sorry?
Timid. They are
Timid.
not...
Yeah, timid.
And on the other hand, what I see is that on the other side there is the idea, let's go back to Keynes. And once I raised my hand in Berlin, it was I think 2009 or 2010, and they said that, you know, the problem was different. The problem was going towards a new kind of economy, and the point of Minsky was exactly that. When there was this stagflation, I am not now buying every detail of Hyman Minsky, but his point was we should put together a Keynesian stimulus with policies about the content of this stimulus, but what he had in mind was a different New Deal, because he was a New Dealer, where there was a stronger socialization of investment, the state intervenes, or some policy interventions on the composition of output, the socialization of investment. Now I think that the way the full employment, the so-called, how it is called, job proposal, no, job guarantee by the MMT is too easy, but you know, that was the direction. It's a completely different outlook. Now, the real problem is, could be this manageable for capitalism and up to a point? I am all in favor of testing it. You know, I am in favor of the Kaleski's 1943 attitude. Is permanent full employment compatible with capitalism? No, but this does not mean that you don't go for that for a while. Then we can discuss. Now I go back to the other point that was raised for me by your talk, but more than that by your answers. You said in your talk at the beginning that the laws of the whole are not just the aggregation of individual behavior. But at the same time you said that, if I understood well, that the macro is founded on individual behavior. Now I have some doubts about the founded. This comes also from your considerations about pure credit. Pure credit does not exist. Now let me argue, probably this is a crazy argument, I don't know, but from the idea that the laws of the whole are not only more than the aggregation, but that in a sense the logic of the whole is the opposite of the logic of the individual. The three examples are, take Marx in the chapters on the section on reproduction. If you read it, he repeatedly say, we said this, now it is the opposite. Example, on the labor market, before it was an exchange of equals. Now the workers are slaves of capitalists, but capitalists as a whole, you know. Second example, Keynes, no, the role of saving and the so-called paradox of saving. You know, for the individuals, it is perfectly rational to increase their savings or decrease their savings according to their expectations and utility maximization and all that. But if you take the perspective of Keynes' treatise on money, if all the savers want to realize all the savings in a moment of time, simply they are destroying their wealth. They are not realizing their wealth. Now let us go to the point of pure credit. I think that the laws of the system of banks is not the same that the laws of the individual banks. let us take the individual banker. For the individual banker, he needs to get money savings. How much of the credit market, of the deposit markets he get, the higher he can create loans. If I am almost a monopolist of the deposit markets, the more I can create loans safely. But at least in modern credit systems, it is loans that creates deposits, not the other way around. For the individual banker, it looks as if it is the opposite. So why I am doubtful of the word founded? Because, you know, when Marx wrote the first volume of Capital, he had the idea, it looks at this way, that he can push competition away from the first book of Capital. Because in the first book of Capital, you know, it was the general laws of capital. Then he realized that he couldn't do so. He had to take into account individual behavior. But in my view, he was looking for the micro foundation that was building, that was, how to say, realizing the macro laws. And this is in fact what you say in a lot of writings, you know. In your criticism of Dobb, I think that at least part of the argument, it is in this way. Then you, and rightly so, went into looking which kind of competition was theoretically sound, but could also be sound empirically. Because I completely agree with your idea that you must be empirically sound. But you know, the movement is from the theory, from the empirically sound, for me, not the other way around. I know it is a bit of a provocation, but it was curious of your reaction.
Stop a second.
Just 1 second, because we had to change. Okay, you can go.
Okay, again, I think there's not much disagreement here. This is the kind of question that we need to sit around with some beer or martinis and discuss some more. I would love to do that.
Next time.
Well, I mean, I'm coming to Italy. I'm on leave for the whole year, so I plan to do
Good.
dropping in during the semester. I agree that what I meant to say that macro laws are different, but they are founded in emergent in individual properties, and the macro is in fact the expression of individual behavior. And I repeatedly refer to a physicist by the name of Robert Laughlin in my chapter 3, which is on theory really, who makes a point that aggregate laws are what he calls robustly indifferent to the details of the micro laws. And I do this with an agent-based simulation where I show that a neoclassical set of agents, a random set of agents, agents that operate in a model based on something that Dosey had done. One set of agents moves towards others in their neighborhood. They imitate, and the others move away and create new things. You can think of it as older and younger people, whatever. But I show that all of them give identical aggregate behavior. So you cannot read the micro behavior from the aggregate. But it doesn't mean that you don't need the micro behavior, because there are other phenomena for which it's clear. I often use this example of what I call the Tahrir Square problem. In the uprising in Egypt, if everybody goes to Tahrir Square to oppose the dictatorship, then the thing falls apart. It's only because people continue to do what they do with some variation that the aggregate exists. It ceases to exist when people stop doing what they do. And that happens in wars and disasters and political upheavals and all that, which is important because we want to change the aggregate sometimes. I use the term emergent properties, which is a fashionable term now, of the aggregate coming out of the behavior of individuals. But I totally agree that the behavior of aggregates is not necessarily deducible from the behavior of individual. That's what Laughlin actually says, that there is no law in physics at an aggregate level which has ever been derived from individual behavior, ever. But it is a problem in physics to reconcile those two behaviors. You can't have a law in physics that is contradictory to the individual behavior either. So there's a necessary connection, which means that macroeconomists should know microeconomics, and microeconomists never have to know anything, as far as I can tell. On the savings, you're right. Again, by implication, there are patterns at the macro level that don't apply at the individual level. But one has to be careful to know which patterns those are. The specific argument made by Keynesians that the paradox of thrift is an argument I reject, because I note that it depends on the idea that the savings rate in the aggregate is independent of all of the outcomes. And I make the point that that is not true empirically and is not true theoretically either. So therefore you may have outcomes if people save more. They may in fact be a positive aspect to it that the Keynesians ignore, which is the availability of liquidity, the effect on the net rate of profit and the growth rate and so on, and the capacity utilization rate too, by the way. And then the last point, again, I agree totally that loans create deposits. I tried to make that point in my discussion, but loans don't create profit. There's a very important difference. Deposits are not profit. Loans have to create a revenue. As firms expand the loans, they create deposits, but the degree to which they expand loans depends on their reserves, which are the non-creation by credit, and the profits depend on the revenue they get for the interest minus the costs of their operation. And so if it were true that loans create profit, then every bank would be infinitely big. Individual banks have this limit, that is, they lend out money, their existence becomes more insecure, because they have to support the loans and support the deposits by reserves, otherwise they can go bankrupt. And it doesn't take much for banks, as you know, to go bankrupt when the curtain is pulled back. So all of these things, I think I agree, and I don't see any contradiction between them and grounding the work in a more consistent framework of real competition and so on. History of thought is a source of questions and ideas, but you can't add the ideas of different economists together in a coherent whole. It's not how that works.
I completely agree. I thank you very much. One last question. Would you have problem if we put this thing on YouTube, if we succeed?
Not at all. No. I have just to let people know that I have a web page called realecon.org, which contains all the videos. It contains all the data from my book. I mean, every step of the data, from the raw data to the final. So the spreadsheets are there, and it contains a discussion group discussions also. So I would like to add this discussion to that, and people can participate further. I'm encouraging people to sort of raise new questions, and puzzles, and all of that, because that's a normal science.
So when I put it, or better, when some of my students more technologically good will put it on YouTube, we'll let you know where it is, and you add it on yours.
And we'll add it to that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Riccardo, and thank you for the group. I'm very honored. Thank you.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Va bene.
Chiudi.